Hello from Colorado. I'm staying at about 9,000 feet, and when I'm cycling, I'm at 9,000 up to about 12,000 feet. So very high altitude, and I wanted to make this video to share with you some tricks and hints for if you're going to take a trip or train at altitude. So the first thing to keep in mind, which you probably already know, is stay hydrated, avoid alcohol, caffeine, and really heavy foods in excessive amounts those first couple of days because your body's really adjusting to the altitude. You're probably going to get a little dehydrated and your sleep will likely be bad. You'll feel out of breath. And it hits people at different altitudes. Some people might start feeling this around 5,000 or 6,000 feet. Some might be 7,000 feet. Most people will probably feel some kind of effect above 7,000 feet. So the next thing to keep in mind is that when you go to altitude, if you're training by metrics like heart rate and FTP, those might change. I've noticed with the athletes I coach, when they go to altitude and they're used to training at sea level, their max heart rate might be a little dulled. So maybe they'd get into the 170s, for example, at sea level after hard effort, but at altitude, they might not be able to break 160. So don't be surprised if you see that. If you're training by heart rate at altitude, you might want to take it down a notch. How much you take it down is really dependent on you, dependent on the altitude you're at. So the best bet is just take a couple of rides once you're there and sort of establish your new baseline of heart rate at altitude for different intensities. And then the same goes for FTP. If you Google it, you'll see a lot of different formulas. So I'm at 9,000 feet and I knocked about 15 watts off my FTP. But as with heart rate, everyone's different. So you might be knocking more or less. My advice for that is work with your coach to establish how much to knock off, or just Google it and use one of the calculations you find on the internet. Okay, so a few other things to keep in mind at altitude. Whenever I've come up to altitude with hydraulic brakes, I notice that they pull into the bars a little bit more, and I think it has to do with the air pressure. So I'm always kind of shocked when I go down that first hill and I hit the brakes and they're almost bottoming out. So I find myself having to pump the brakes a lot to kind of like solidify them. And they will pump up, but just keep that in mind as you're going down these long descents at altitude. The first pull of your brake might pull in too much and you might need to pump it a bit. The next thing I notice at altitude is that the air feels thinner and I basically gain speed faster. So that's great for when I'm cruising on flats. I can go a little bit faster than I might at sea level, but on downhills, that's also great if you want to go fast, but keep in mind you can gain speed faster than you're expecting to. So that can be dangerous in some situations. So do be aware that on fast downhill descents, you might pick up speed faster than you're used to, and be ready for that. And another thing to keep in mind is stay up on hydration, of course. And then also your body might be wanting and needing more carbohydrates to fuel these efforts at high altitudes. So don't slack on the carbs. Don't be afraid to have a bit more carbs than you might normally take. Okay, have fun. Altitude training is great. I love it, especially if you can stay up there for a week or two. When you come back to sea level, you might feel like you have a superpower for a couple days.